real pleasure for me to be in conversation with Professor Jatindra Kumar Nayak, whom I think of as Jatin or Jatin Nayak. I've known Jatin since 1987, right? So, what does that make it? How many years? Something plus, something 5.
30. How old I am?
That's how old he is.
35 years. 36. 6. Look at my maths. Anyway, 36 years. So this is soon after I arrived in Oxford and as a graduate student, and felt somewhat out of sorts over there. And after my a very strange, I would say Jatin-like life at University College London, where I took part in nothing at all. Arriving in Oxford was to suddenly encounter, a more kind of functional university life, a life which could be identified as being, belonging to students, teachers, lectures, things that were happening, and a lot of Indians. It had been a long time since I'd come into contact with so many Indians in one place, outside of India. So I was glad to be introduced to Jatin, because that relieved me from the stress of having to interact with these Indians. Jatin, of course, is Indian himself, as am I. So one is creating some sort of inner tension within that landscape by saying that it was a relief for me to run into Jatin, and we became friends, and we'll talk about various things, including that friendship, in the course of our conversation. I thought that instead of having Jatin present a paper or present an academic paper on an academic subject, which I'm sure he'll do at some point in the future if he keeps this relationship which began this term with Ashoka going into the future, which I hope it will. But I thought we could start off with things in a format which selfishly interested me, and a format of conversation and rather than lecturing, and informal conversation, through which we hope to sort of bring in the kind of things which get spoken about in one lecture or another, but maybe in a more kind of diffuse, informal, free-flowing way, allow certain kind of preoccupations we've had to come in through anecdote, memory, reminiscing, maybe even satire. So that's the intention of this evening. So we'll come back or move forward to Oxford, which is there in the title of this talk given to me by Jatin, gradually. Let's start at the beginning, and through that hope to bring in the kind of history that produced Jatin, but also the history of the last, not 36 years, 50 years, maybe going further back. And the cusp we both inhabited at that time in Oxford, when the new India was emerging at the end of the 80s. So Jatin was different from others I met because of where he was coming from, the background he brought with him, and his literariness. And I want to sort of address this confluence of these various things. Orissa, Oriya language, a deep literariness in various languages, including English literature. So, firstly, where were you born, Jatin?
Let me begin by saying it's an absolute delight to be here and to be participating in this exciting event. although it's a daunting privilege, I feel a little scared but excited at the same time. So I was born in a village near Bhubaneswar in Orissa. Bhubaneswar is the capital city of Orissa, which is now quite a burgeoning city. But 50 years ago or 60 years ago, it was a very uninviting place, a small town, an overgrown village. And my village was only 12 or 13 kilometers from Bhubaneswar. And it was very close to a historically famous place, a site called Dholi, where the famous Kalinga War was fought in 261 BC. So it was historically very famous, but my village was an obscure place. It was only 15 kilometers from Bhubaneswar, but it felt millions of miles away. So I visited Bhubaneswar maybe when I was 15 or 16. So to cover the distance of 15 kilometers, it took me perhaps 12 years or 13 years. So that was the kind of stagnant, static world I was born into. It's a small
Did you
village.
feel it to be a stagnant and static world?
No, as a child I did, because we thought that we are the center of the universe. Obviously, we never thought that. But later, looking back, one feels how it was cut off from the rest of the world. But so that was the village.
You don't think of it anymore of being the center of the universe in any sense.
No, I don't think the universe has a center anymore. So, but at that point of time, it seemed the center of the universe. It was a very small village, only 1 or 2 kilometers away from the grand Jagannath Road, which led to Puri, and only 3 or 4 kilometers from a very small town, which is also famous for its applique work, Pipili. It's a very small town, but when I was a child, it felt like a metropolis. We would walk to watch the Dasara, Durga Puja. So for 3-4 kilometers, we would walk in a procession, young children, led by our teacher, and we thought that we were entering a metropolis because that little place had electricity. Our village didn't have. Our village came to have electricity in the 1980s, although it was only 12 or 15 kilometers from Bhubaneswar. So that was what made us feel that we were cut off from the rest. We didn't have electricity. So that was the marker of modernity, that we lived in a backward place because we had to study in the light of lanterns, hurricane lamps, and things. So that was the village I was born in.
But I asked you that question about whether it continues to be, of course, I mean, the center of the universe in any sense, because my parents, who grew up in Sylhet, but of course that was a fully formed town. But they continue to, in some ways, think it was the center of the universe. They had left it behind with partition, but it was a kind of benchmark for them. But that is, of course, a very different experience from the one you are referring to. But what about then Orissa? Before we come to specificities to do with Ravenshaw College and other places, does Orissa constitute some sort of benchmark for interpreting things?
Of course, I think we were aware of our identity as Odias, and our village was so close to the state capital. And when I was born, that was in 1955 or 56, it was a state that was slowly emerging, very painfully emerging from its poverty, backwardness, because the state is notoriously poor. In 1936, when it became a separate province, the governor of Orissa was actually a great grand nephew of Jane Austen. So a backward state, but we had the John Austen Hubbard. He was the governor, and he actually has written a book. I later discovered only 8 copies exist in the world. Children and Parents in Jane Austen. Only 8 copies. And he wrote his unpublished memoir. Memoirs are available in Cambridge, South. And I read 70 pages that he wrote on. And his disappointment with Orissa. 1936, he comes as governor and says this province doesn't have anyone whom I can appoint as an advisor. This state is extremely poor. It doesn't have money. So in his lecture, he says that all the legislators, because there was an election, there was a ministry, 1937. So he tells them that you can submit proposals, but I will reject them because I don't have money. So that was Orissa. We always associated it with poverty and backwardness.
Yes.
So, and as you told, the state capital in 1960s was an overgrown village. Nothing, only the Lingaraj temple, which is a very famous temple, and a sleepy little town. The nerve center of administration was in Cuttack, which had a much richer history associated with the freedom struggle. It was actually the capital of all the dynasties. So Bhubaneswar was chosen for strange reasons as the state capital. It was actually an Rajendra Lala Mitra, this famous archaeologist in 19th century, wrote, it's an uninviting place full of hungry priests. So that was we saw the place grow slowly into the modern smart, they now call it a smart city, or a city that wants to be smart.
Nice. Yeah.
So smart, so we feel very, very nervous whenever I walk through the city. Maybe I'm not very smart, but in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, this was a very, very sleepy, backward place. So we associated Odisha with backwardness, with poverty, with lack of communication. Even Sambalpur in western Odisha was linked to Cuttack or Bhubaneswar with a railway link. So that was the Odisha we.
But what about Cuttack then? Was that a different kind of?
Cuttack again was a small town, but it had a cosmopolitan character, something that Bhubaneswar didn't have. Bhubaneswar was a temple town, as I told you, with hungry priests. Even in 1950s, people are scared of tigers there. So in the evening, people don't go out. Even today, elephants come in and create problems. But Cuttack was always a cosmopolitan place. In the sense, you have Christians, you have Anglo-Indians, you have Telugus, you have Marwadis, you have Chinese. So all the dentists were Chinese, all the shops were owned by Chinese. So you had a kind of cosmopolitan character to a very small town. It is a very small town, but it has a cosmopolitan and layers of history. And it was again associated with the freedom struggle in a big way, and the identity movement that Orissa should be a separate province on the basis of language. So Cuttack was a vibrant place culturally, and it had a very close link with Kolkata, something that Bhubaneswar didn't have. Kolkata was our window on modernity. Everyone, there was a Bengali settlement there, so that was called Bengali Sahi. Every Odia who became someone in life went to Kolkata, and they got educated there, and they had a love-hate relationship with Kolkata. They would go there, get humiliated, but then would like to emulate them. They would like to compete with them.
So a fair amount of hate.
Oh, love-hate, but
there was love as well.
Love as well, because every Odia, I think the architects of modern Odisha were all trained there, all educated there. Madhusudan Das, Gopavan, the writers, the painters, the filmmakers, they all went to Kolkata. Will have a bittersweet experience because they will be looked down upon, considered, the word for Odias was Ude.
Yeah.
And they are considered animals who don't have tails. Because they saw, when the Bengalis came, they saw these Odia laborers climbing up coconut trees. So they thought that they are monkeys without tails. So Odias also had very nasty things to say about Bengalis, but since they are less prosperous, they are less advanced, they have less exposure to British rule, they were a little timid.
Yeah.
Wouldn't say those things very aggressively, in their absence maybe.
Yes. So, and your relationship with literature and Bangla literature, Odia literature, English literature. Can you tell us?
Yeah, I think that to a large extent, as a child, I think my father was a primary school teacher. I received very little formal education, middle English school. There are two kinds of schools in those days. Middle vernacular school where English won't be taught, and middle English school where a modicum of English will be taught. So he received education in a middle English school and dropped out. After that he wouldn't continue his education for reasons of health and all that. But he was an autodidact. He taught himself Sanskrit, he taught himself English, he taught, of course he mastered Odia literature or immersed himself in Odia literature. And he built a small library. So you had so many books at home. And he wrote books for children, textbooks as well as storybooks for children. So I grew up in an environment which was bookish. So I was surrounded by books, so I read them, although I didn't understand them. But having a library in a remote village, 1,500 books, magazines, so that I think instilled in me a kind of passion for print, not necessarily literature. I think it was the desire to see my name in print. I thought my father was a superhuman being because books carried his name in print. So as a child in a village, I thought that one day my name will also appear in. So sometimes what I would do, I would insert my name into his textbooks. Because in the textbooks for school children, there will be letters. Model letters. So X will write a letter to Y. So in the address, I'll put my name. And that he would allow. So I would see my name in print, and that was perhaps the beginning of my interest in literature, my immersion in Odia literature. And he also had, as I told you, he taught himself English. Long after he died, I once discovered, I came across a diary which was maintaining in English. He had no English education, but he had a passion for literature in every language. So English, Sanskrit, Odia, whatever he could lay his hands on, he read. And he wrote all his life. So maybe that's what I owe my interest.
So it's your father rather than your mother?
No, my mother was a great reader. She received very little education, but she would read books. So I saw her read books. But I think my father wrote books. I think writing I found more interesting than reading. So I thought writing confers on you a kind of identity which reading may not. So I thought that I should see my name in print. So that was how I began taking an interest in Odia literature. And then I'll come to another source of interest in the course of the conversation.
So a lot of connection with daydreaming as well. Fantasizing, not just kind of pedagogical inclinations. In fact, in some ways the opposite, a kind of fantasy to do with writing, daydreaming, which is quite separate from scholarly bent as such. But there's a lot of that. I mean, in the trajectories of that time, your father, and maybe you, a little bit in you as well, in terms of these really unexpected journeys and trajectories. And one thinks of various fathers in literature also based on real fathers, like the one in Pother Pachari, for instance, by Vibhuti Bhushan Banerjee, but also Naipaul's father for him. So, but then you went to Ravenshaw College. But am I jumping?
No, you're jumping. I think I would stop you there for a bit. I think there is also another source of it. As I told you, I think the passion for print or passion for literature is something that I didn't experience in school, in the primary school. I think we associated with associate schools with beating. I think the teachers would beat us, discipline and all that. And sometimes you would write the name of a teacher in a palm leaf and bury it in mud so that the idea is that you die. Sometimes we wanted, because we were always worried about our exam results. So what I do is try to put some rats in the almirah so that they will devour all the examination scripts. But we couldn't find any rats that day. We found some crabs. But crabs don't destroy paper. So we only left them in the almirah just to harass the teacher. So schools were not a very exciting place, obviously associated with punishment, but I think something else happened which deepened my interest in literature, also widened its scope. That my elder brother, who was 10 years older than me, was a student of English literature. So he also brought a lot of English books home. So I read a lot of, I achieved this miracle. Read a lot of English books without understanding them. So read.
Gregor did that with German.
So I read, because all the books he would hide in a cupboard, lock them, but I will find a way of taking these books out of them and look at them, and they smell better than Odia books. Because they are published by better publishers. And I would read them, because I was acquainted with the English alphabet. So I'd read them, I would devour them hungrily, but didn't understand them. So that also generated in me a kind of fantasy of reading English literature. So I also wrote a letter. absolutely ungrammatical English. When I was a class 5 student, to a friend in this great metropolis called Pipili, which was only 3 miles away. So this audacity was, I think, implanted in me by the circumstances. My father's love for Odia literature, collecting books. He would go to Cuttack to the publishers and get all the brand new books, volumes, because he would get them free as an author. And then my brother, nearly 200, 300 books. Fielding, Hardy, Count of Monte Cristo, everything. And I would read them without understanding them. I would smell them. I would try to look at the blurbs, may understand maybe 3 words out of 50. But I made this desperate effort to enter a world which seemed terribly inaccessible to me. So
for reasons of daydreaming or self-betterment?
I think the idea of self-betterment, since my father was a school teacher with 7 children, the idea was that somehow you get a job at some point.
Yeah.
But we didn't know what jobs are available. The only jobs we saw around us are school teachers' jobs, or police constables' jobs, or maybe the highest job that we could think of in a village was, how many of you are aware of this job called sub-registrar? Because in a village everyone buys and sells land, so the sub-registrar is a great man, a coveted post, and also because they took a lot of bribes. So our idea was, I mean, maybe people in the village thought that if you are very successful, you will become a sub-registrar. So, of course, there was no idea of self-betterment. There was no self at that time to be better. So I think it was fantasy. It was just the fantasy of an exciting world which these books, which I can't read, will reveal.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's good to be able to introduce all of this to students here, because we are presented with very curtailed ideas of what drives people in terms of writing, whether it's fiction or scholarship, or what the provenances are. But there is I mean, you're not singular. I mean, in many ways you are singular, but you are part of a long history of such such journeys, which I fear are being erased, that the memory of those histories. So now do you want to go to your move to Ravenshaw College?
Little bit, I think before that I went to another small, it's not a bigger village, I shouldn't call it a small town, to study, to receive high school education. So, and there I think I got introduced to a bigger and brighter world, because people would come to those schools to deliver lectures from colleges, from towns. And I started buying books. I stole some money from my father, or sometimes asked him to give some. And there was this publisher called Wilco and Jacob in Bombay. And they would publish very cheap editions of La Miserable or Anna Karenina. So I got some 10, 15 such books. I would get them. It's called VPP. I don't think the post offices have those provisions even today.
Yeah.
So I would 2 rupees, 3 rupees I would sometimes steal, sometimes from my father, or beg him to give me some money. So I began building my own library. So by this time I was able to understand 30% of a book written in English. So I would read Hardy.
By this time meaning how old?
By the time I was maybe 14 or 15. So I was obsessed with making sense of these books which smelled better, okay, and had better covers. The Odia books, the covers would be so crudely done. The illustration was so crude. But here, Treasure Island, they looked, I mean, the Long John Silver looked so attractive. Or, I mean, because they were published on Macmillan. Or Tales from Tagore. All the illustrations so good, E.F. Dowd. And by the time I came to high school stage, I think I started devouring all the Les Miserables, the Fielding, Bernard Shaw, everything I read. As I told you, I understood only 20 to 30% of it. But there was a kind of fanatic wish to get to know a world which seems so inaccessible. I didn't have, my vocabulary was severely limited. But I got a sense of what I tried to follow the storyline. Forgot about the atmosphere, forgot about point of views, Henry James. I didn't know all these people. I only followed the course of the plot. So what happens to the characters at the end? Do they marry? Does he die? The hero. the heroine is beautiful, and is a beautiful woman marrying an ugly man. So all these questions I would like to answer at the end of, and sometimes whenever I would fail, I will come to that later. Some books would give me consolation. So I will do very badly in an examination for my own fault, but I will think of love miserable. So that character suffered. So many great characters have suffered. Who am I? So if I have missed a few marks, I have not been able to answer a few questions, I am a tragic figure. Because great people have also in literature suffered. So this literature is beginning to give me consolation.
And a kind of self-image as a tragic figure in the making.
Yes, I think whenever I suffered for my own faults, I would always say that great things are happening. because I'm like someone who failed miserably in life, suffered terribly. Count of Monte Cristo,
yes.
All these people they suffered. I also suffered.
Yes.
But actually, I was being insincere. I was not doing well at my studies, and so that gave a veneer of whatever solace.
So you were an undergraduate at Ravenshaw College?
Yeah, after high school I went to Ravenshaw College. But before that in high school, some people would come and give lectures. And these people would have degrees like MA London. So we thought that they are superhuman. Anyone who's when I was in London, when I was in America, we thought that they belong to a superior species of humanity. And they have seen a world which is very different, radically different from the shabby banality that our world depicts. So something of the college, and by that time my elder brother had already passed his MA in English. So more books were at home, and we met more friends from Ravenshaw. So in the high school time, I think my intellectual or academic horizon expanded because I read all these books, however shoddily, however imperfectly I understood them, but I got acquainted with a lot of, like Maupassant, and I translated some of these stories. I still remember some of very moving, haunting stories of Maupassant. 3 pages, 4 pages, I translated them into Odia. So I thought that I will enrich Odia literature. So the audacity, there is always this audacity.
But what about your I mean, we have so much to cover, so I want to move on to Ravenshaw. What about your love for style, prose style, turn of phrase, which even comes through in the way you speak?
I think when I was a school student, I wouldn't bother about turns of phrase or anything. The most important thing was able to understand, grasp the contours of the plot, and identify with characters or hate characters. So I think up to that point, but when I started translating these stories into Odia, even as a 16-year-old boy, I found that, well, I come up against difficulties which have nothing to do with plot. Some resonance, or something about the text, something about the style, something about the way, the texture of the text that I am unable to carry into Odia.
Yeah.
So I became vaguely aware of something more than plot and character.
Because Maupassant is a very interesting stylist, but we don't speak of him, at least in India at that time.
So I felt defeated by some the nuances of those, but I somehow got the plot. So the story came out in my translation, but I wasn't happy with it. I thought I was missing something. So,
at Ravenshaw College, when you were an undergraduate, is that when John Carey visited?
That was actually Utkal University in Bhubaneswar. That came much later.
Much later.
So going from or moving from a village school to Ravenshaw was actually a disconcerting experience. The first thing, Cuttack may look like an overgrown village now, but to me it seemed a howling metropolis when I came from my village. And Ravenshaw, the architecture had this majesty and the beauty, something that I was completely overwhelmed by, because not many of us, even I didn't know for a very long time that this beautiful building, majestic, and that was actually planned by an Australian architect in 1919. So it's a huge building with quads, with lawns and symmetrically organized architecture. And when I entered that university, that college, now it's a university, I lost my way. So because everything seemed similar. Because the school where I studied was on a 2-storied building, most of it was thatched. So that and this huge campus with very smart people moving around, I thought that, well, these belong to another planet. So Ravenshaw was a disconcerting experience, exposure to another kind of architecture and another kind of world. So that's where everything was English. Everything was taught through the medium of English. So that was another break. But I was somehow prepared. But that was what was happening to everyone. Everyone came from a village. Then suddenly the medium of instruction was English, and everybody coped with it. That wasn't a problem in those days. Nowadays, a student comes from a village school, finds it extremely difficult to manage in Ravenshaw College. And there, I think, I got exposed to this wider world. For instance, there was a professor K.S.R. Murthy, and I would walk past. He's a professor of physics, and he was a PhD cantor. So I said, who is this man? And this man would go out and give lectures on Orwell, Auden, Spender, because he knew F.R. Lewis in Cambridge. So that was an exposure to a very different kind of world. That here is this man, a professor of physics, he's talking about F.R. Lewis, he's talking about Solzhenitsyn, he's talking about the first day I arrived in Ravenshaw College and lived in a hostel. There was a function and he was giving a lecture. And he was talking about Orwell's Animal Farm, Auden's Vertical Man, and he was talking about Solzhenitsyn. So Yeats, he began with Turning and Turning in the Widening Gyre. That was at the age of 17 or 18, I listened to a Cambridge professor, Cambridge trained professor talking physics, talking about literature. So that was an enriching, unsettling, and disconcerting experience. So,
tell us about how you got to Oxford.
Well, I think, again, I must talk about Oxford was always never in the radar.
Of course.
And 1970s was a time of transition in Indian politics in Orissa, everywhere. Because very soon the emergency was looming. 1971, very soon we'll have emergency. There was a great political instability. And around that time, the state, in every state, the higher education institutions were decaying. JNU was emerging in Delhi. So it was drawing like a magnet from lower middle class students are coming to Delhi. So all the great institutions, Allahabad, Patna, Ravenshaw, they were all beginning to decay. So it was a time of transition, painful time. And we never thought of, and in those days I think people were thinking of going to America. So USA, the middle class was getting obsessed with.
Certainly in Bombay, to do MBAs.
Yeah, so slowly things were changing and we never thought of going abroad. We were worried about getting a job. So there was only one, in Ravenshaw English departments, in the past there were two professors, Professor D.V. John, Professor Sundaram, they were from Oxford. So we would always, and in Kotak we had only Oxford tailor. So I would get my clothes stitched there. So Oxford was kind of, it had a prestige, it has an aura. But very few thought that they could go to Oxford. One of the reasons is pragmatic, go to America, make a lot of money, settle there, or come back and intimidate people, saying that when I was so there are two things. So nobody, and the other thing was that Oxford had this aristocratic aura. Only one Odia had been there, and he belonged to a family in which there are governors, there are secretaries, there were great politicians, he was related to chief ministers. So we thought that, well, it's meant for such people. So Oxford was never in the radar. So we thought that, well, and once I visited his house, this great academic bureaucrat who had done a B.Litt from Oxford. So I looked at we had gone there to his house to request him to stop examining us. There was something called internal examination, and we hated it. So we requested him to abolish it. And he treated us with lofty contempt and all that. So we were college students. Then I saw his brass nameplate, B.Litt Oxford, A.M. Columbia. I wasn't interested in A.M. Columbia. I was impressed by, overwhelmed by that brass nameplate. I still remember the color, copper, brass, and B.Litt Oxford. This is heaven. I wish I could ever go there and sit like this man and dismiss other people. So that was my first introduction to something like B.Litt Oxford. But I never thought that I could go there. Then this accident, I would call it a happy accident. I passed my MA. Before that, let me tell you that I was just I can think of my life as a series of failures, because in Ravenshaw I became a student of science, gave it up. because I realized that I can dissect frogs, I can understand solid geometry, I hated the smell of chemicals in the chemistry laboratory, so I gave up. Then I wanted to become a journalist. No, after MA, I went to, after BA, I went to JNU to do history. Then I realized that history is not for me. So I attended few classes. Still my caution money is lying with JNU. 100 rupees, they owe me. So attended classes by Romila Thapa, Bipin Chandra, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, Professor Gopal. And then realized that I can be a great historian. So
what does it take to be one?
I thought that reading a lot. I've been reading a lot of very boring books. So all these books by Vishweswar Prasad, all this rise and fall of economic nationalism. So I thought that, well, this is not for me. I still love stories. I said, there are no stories here, I think. So history I left. Then I became a journalist after my MA in Times of India. I spent 1 month. I also decided that I can meet deadlines. I'll be dead before I meet them. So I left that. So it's a series of failures. So then I joined Sambalpur University, Mofussil University, 300-400 kilometers away from Bhubaneswar. So I joined there. I became a young lecturer. And once I came to Utkal University to attend a seminar, which was addressed by Professor John Carey. And Mulrine and so on. John Carey is 6'4". So during tea break, nobody went and talked to him because everybody was 5'6". I was the only person who could talk to him because he could look at me. Otherwise, he had to look down on me. So we struck up a conversation. And
it's a very good analysis of that situation.
Yeah, I think nobody dared go near him. 6'4", ODIs are generally 5'6" or 5'7". That's the average height.
Yeah.
So I liked his lectures and I talked to him about whatever he was talking about. Then I left. I forgot all about it.
Yes.
Then I won this. Initially, I was selected for a. That's another. If you have the time, I'll just take 2 minutes. After 3 or 4 years, 3 years I felt suffocated in this very rural kind of Mofussil University, and thought that I must go abroad. I must go somewhere else. There is a world elsewhere. So I applied to any place that I could think of. So what I used to do in those universities, always go to the dustbin around 4. The professor and head must have thrown a lot of letters which he didn't want others to see. So I collected a letter. The National University of Singapore had advertised a PhD fellowship or something. So I applied. I thought I must get out of this place. It could be Andamans, it could be Singapore, it could be wherever. But I must leave this place. Geographical displacement was salvation. So I must leave. Then I found this letter in the dustbin. And I applied. Then I was invited to attend an interview to Delhi, the Singapore embassy. Then to my horror and dismay, I found that ENG, they mistook it as engineering. So they sent a professor of engineering to interview. So I succeeded at that interview. He said that, well, whatever, I can't understand what you are saying, but you appear to be sincere. You may do well in Singapore, I don't know. But you get admission, I will give you the fellowship. So that was the most paradoxical, I think, anomalous situation. You get a fellowship, no admission. So I applied to Singapore University for admission. I got the admission. Just when I was about to leave Sambalpur to Singapore, I got a fellowship from the government of India to study abroad. And like all lower middle class, poor ODIs, I thought I would go to America, make a lot of money, or at least settle there and escape. Because by this time, escaping this very constricting academic environment was uppermost in my mind. So in our university, somebody had done his PhD from Stony Brook, mathematics. So that's the only university I applied. Obviously, I had got the scholarship, I got the admission. Then I think one of my teachers told me that, why shouldn't you apply to Oxford? I said, how can I apply to Oxford? Then he reminded me that you had met John Carey. So I wrote a letter to John Carey that I have got this scholarship. Can I go to Oxford? So he said, fine, I'm the chairman admissions committee, and of course, since you have got a scholarship, no problem, you come. Then I fell ill for a year, but luckily for me, this scholarship they could wait until you. So I was down with pleurisy and I suffered for a year and then went to Oxford. That's a happy or unhappy accident, whichever way you look at it. So I went there because this teacher's insistence.
Which year is that?
That was 1982, and October 1982. So that's how I landed in Oxford.
Right. Failing. You mentioned failing,
Yeah.
and and you said you had been watching some of the videos of the symposium on failing.
Yeah.
Part of the literary activism series which we
Yeah.
had in 2020. And in fact, I've been wanting to be in conversation with a few people who I wanted to sort of discuss failing with, and people from different backgrounds. And I thought Jatin would be an instructive and articulate, eloquent speaker. So I'm glad that he brought it up himself. This idea of exploring this particular reality or experience. We'll keep coming to that, but tell us a bit about when you arrived in Oxford, and like Oxford, which I arrived at 5 years after you did. At least among the Indians, it wasn't failing. Failing was not mentioned at all. So we were by then we were in the new India, which now continues.
Yeah,
to
80s. That was the time. When
So failing may have, in some ways, been a comprehensible experience to our forefathers.
Yeah.
Not in terms of something to submit to, but something that shapes life.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a, I don't know how to say this without it making it sound feel good, but not in a negative way, but in some way, in an undeniable way, but there was a denial of this particular form of shaping by the time we arrived, at least by the time I arrived in Oxford. Most of all, among this new set of Indians that I encountered, I have to say, I think we agree on this, I had not seen their like before.
Neither had I, so I'll come to that. I think I drifted into Oxford, but when I arrived there, I realized that most Indians who were there had willed themselves into going to Oxford, and they exercised their will in a vigorous way to be, and they had a goal. They wanted to do something.
So you're distinguishing this from the accidentality of your
I
fantasy.
drifted. I could have been in Stony Brook. I could have actually studied in Singapore. Engineering or literature, whatever. So let me just give you an example of what was happening. So when I arrived in Oxford, I found that many people. I was perhaps from my state. There was only one person, and she was very, very highly motivated. She was part of the Oxford milieu. And then I visited her the first day. Second day.
Sorry to interrupt you. Oxford milieu or the Indian Oxford milieu?
Oxford Indian milieu or Indian Oxford milieu. So I visited her. This is a very interesting story, so you might like it. So I visited her because I was feeling very lonely, lost. And the first day when I went to ask someone for the way to Merton College. So I went to examination school.
That was your college?
Yeah, Merton College. So I wanted to I want to go there to collect my keys. So the porter came from I went to examination school thinking that it's Merton College. So I asked him, where is Merton College? He said, this is not Merton College, and went back inside. I said, what do I do? So I went around walking 3 kilometers, which Merton College was actually behind examination school. That was my first introduction to Merton, Oxford. Then I went to this friend of mine, very senior, and I met 2 Indians there. So that will, I think, illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So they were there, they were happy, they were introduced to me, I was given tea and everything. It was a very dark kind of drizzly day. I was feeling very depressed, homesick. Then they said that on a day like this, they were talking to each other, I was overhearing them. He said, on a day like this, one should drink a bottle of wine and read the whole of Ulysses during one afternoon. So I thought that I should now book my return ticket and go home. How can you read the Ulysses, which I could read only 3 pages during my entire life? How could you read the whole of Ulysses? And remember, one of them became a fairly well-known academic, the other went mad. I won't take that. These two.
So you.
So that was the Oxford.
You became, besides working on Walter Scott.
Yeah.
You became a great recorder and repository of these conversations.
Yes.
Which you reported to others like me.
Yeah.
And
because I used to record these interesting conversations. Like you meet somebody, because we are Indians, who when I met, we used to call these extremely anglicized Indians coconuts. Brown outside, white inside. So in the Ifli street or wherever we met an Indian, we would go to, I said, are you an Indian? He would say, does it show? So we had this disconcerting experience. And the Indians, I talked about these two who wanted to read the whole of Ulysses during one afternoon. So
you told me about this at that time.
So that's one. And
I think we had a sense of not just we didn't have a sense of disapproval, but of bafflement.
Yes, I don't. Nobody actually went out of his or her way to. They were being very kind in a very cruel way. So they didn't understand that it was destroying us.
I mean, I promised Dilip Menon, with whom you overlapped in Oxford. You know, I posted news of this event on Facebook today, and it caused great excitement.
Oh.
And one of the people who left a message was Dilip Menon, and he wrote, "I remember Jatin well during my time at Oxford. He used to stay in the Wellington Square apartment.
Yes.
I recall whenever I dropped in to visit friends like Aditya Mattu, I don't know who that is, Jatin would be slumped in an armchair watching TV endlessly. He was full of lugubrious wit and chronic languor."
Oh, great.
So I said that this is an excellent description, and I would include it in my introduction. And having forgotten to do so, I wanted to bring it in.
He's a failed novelist. He could have written a wonderful, he could have created a wonderful character, memorable character. So the other thing that I noticed that I always thought that I am here to listen to as many brilliant scholars as possible, because I found that the people whom I had read about, Terry Eagleton, John Carey, John Bailey, all these people whom I had read, they were here in person. So I was excited. I wanted to listen to Christopher Ricks, George Steiner. So I was excited that I'd listen to these people and learn as much as I can. But then I met the Indians. They had all mapped out their futures. I didn't know what. I had only a brilliant future behind me. So I thought that I would just learn as much as I can, sample all these experiences, meet as many exciting people as possible. So I learn as much as I can, and if possible improve my English, or write thesis on Walter Scott's reception of Walter Scott. That was a disaster. And I'm the only perhaps living human being who has read all the works of Walter Scott and survived. So that was a disaster. But talking about the Indians that I met there, there is something called Oxford Majlis. And I would go there, nostalgia for Oxford, nostalgia for India, I'd meet fellow Indians. Perhaps in the evening they will invite me for an Indian meal. There was also this hope. So what were the topics? The topics that we discussed: whither India, whither Pakistan, can Pakistan survive? So they are always talking about the larger world, and as if they are all future ambassadors or governors or prime minister. I didn't bother me at all whether Pakistan survives or not, or whither Bangladesh.
But your indifference was not approved of.
No, I think they thought that I wasn't ambitious, therefore I was cynical.
I heard that about you when I arrived.
So I thought that, well, I can't afford this ambition. I can't rule India. I can't rule myself. I can't wake up. Like Dilip Menon says that I can't wake up in the morning. Most of the time, look back at my diary, and every day I say, I hate myself for having woken up at 11:30, or watching TV until 1:30, or going to London and not coming back, staying in a friend's house until I have outlived my welcome.
So I want to open this up to questions, but there are a few things we should maybe quickly discuss. We've already overrun. because of at least I am sort of absorbed by this conversation. So what we may not have been very clear to us was the kind of transition being made into the new India, which then came into existence from the 90s onwards, especially after economic deregulation, when many of these people actually took control after they came back, of the media, or formed a part of a larger kind of diaspora. Whatever that word meant, it achieved a new kind of status at that time. So we may not have been aware of the fact that this
at
is
that time.
Yeah, because all the things you're talking about, and the comprehensibility of failure, the tendencies towards daydreaming. I mean, these were not completely alien to us when we were growing up. They were part of a natural kind of habitat. I mean, there was a lot of it about. It's only when a particular time arrived, and when we arrived in Oxford, coinciding with the time, that it seemed like a very strange thing to do, to occupy that particular sort of mode of not achievement, but fantasy. So then one of the questions I've been curious about is, you became gradually conversant through your anomalous passion for literature, for the smell of books, etc., for the materiality of that experience. You became not only conversant but deeply engaged with the English language. And this engagement is not new among people who grew up with another language in India, except that many of those people go on to write, most of those people another time went on to write in their language. And English remains part of their literary, not only horizon, their makeup, but they write in another language. You, however, is it symptomatic of the time that you committed to English? You did not write in Oriya. Oriya remains the first language. English is part of this shock of who you kind of become in terms of your contact with the literary. And then you commit yourself to English in some way. I mean, commit is maybe not the right word. But that becomes.
Started using it more often. I think when I went to Oxford, because of this feeling of homesickness and feeling of loneliness and feeling a little diffident among highly confident people, because everybody was confident, and I found confidence not infectious. I wasn't infected by that confidence. I became even more diffident because everyone was confident. Everyone was congratulating each other. Most of the time they are congratulating. They have become something. Somebody has got a fellowship elsewhere. Somebody is going somewhere. Somebody is marrying. So everybody is congratulating everyone. So one day somebody will murder me and then will congratulate me. So this was the world I couldn't connect with until I think you came, Rohit came, and all these other friends. So I couldn't even share so I started withdrawing into myself and tried to see my own life, because I was taken away from this life that I had lived in India. So I started reflecting upon that life and used English to write about that life, because I suddenly realized that most of the time students of English literature, like me, like many others, they haven't used English to write about lived experience. It was largely derivative. We read books, we summarized them. I did well in exams because I was a better summarizer. Somebody didn't do well because he or she couldn't summarize well. So I suddenly realized that English is a language which, even Odia, I have never used them to record, to explore, to understand lived experience. So I started maintaining a diary, started writing about my past, writing about the world I had left behind. So that way, but again there I failed as a writer. But in order to overcome my homesickness, I started translating an autobiography in Odia in Oxford, from which you have taken an excerpt in your Picador book. So I got a book from India, Fakir Mohan Senapati's autobiography. Every day I would translate 2 pages or 1 page to overcome the feeling of homesickness. So to establish an intimate connect with my world.
And homesickness was a taboo subject, though.
Everybody should appear absolutely at home. Exactly. And I was always homeless.
And this is a feature of globalization. So in sudden stricture, you have to be at home.
So I can talk to anybody about what I remembered about my childhood, or what I remembered about the small town I had left behind, or the great teachers who taught me, or the wonderful songs that we sang. I couldn't talk about. Everybody is congratulating each other and leaving for Harvard. So, or coming back and becoming governor is a bank. So what do? I had no interest in governing anything. I was unable to govern myself or my own memories. So I was among people who were extremely confident, extremely successful, highly motivated, and wanted to rule the world. I didn't want the world to rule me. That's the only thing that
was, and Simon Cooper has written a book to talk about how similarly, something very similar, I mean, we could say that this is happening in left liberal India, in a new liberal elite. In the UK, this was happening among the rise of the new Tory party.
Yes, I also
Boris Johnson.
I had a few friends among the British, and I noticed
that it was happening in Oxford at the time.
Yeah, so and the coal miner strike was being crushed.
Yes.
Margaret Thatcher was on the ascendant.
Yes.
And everybody was talking like Margaret Thatcher, looking like Margaret Thatcher. It's very difficult. So that kind of harshness attracted that world. That what is it? Get off your ass.
Yeah.
So now unemployed. She told the unemployed to get off your ass, get up on a bike.
Get on your bike. Norman Teddy.
So everybody was behaving like that. I was getting scared.
Yeah.
So I wanted to leave.
Yes. So the last question. I mean, so something was going on then, and then it very quickly entrenched itself.
Yeah.
And now, all these years later, we partly see, to bring in the idea of failure again, we see a failure having taken place with the rise of the right.
Yeah.
So it was a self-perpetuating, self-entrenching elite that came into place at that time, and then the right has come into existence now. Going against seemingly the values of this group, but actually going against secular values, or if that's a very anodyne term, which were put in place in those languages as well.
Yeah.
Modern Oriya, not talking about Oriya, whether it's a classical language, modern Bengali.
Yeah.
All those projects putting a very rich sort of experiential sort of idea of the secular, which made us secular in the last 200 years. So when we think of a project failing, we think it's the Constitution, and then the custodians of the Constitution we came into contact with at that time. But something that goes back to your father and grandfather, and the world, the space they created, which allowed you to emerge. That is the loss. That's gone. That went earlier. It went earlier with the emergence of this elite, which didn't seem to remember that particular world of bilingual modernity or multilingual modernity, and its experience of secularism. But anyway, from the point of view of now, what would you see?
I think we increasingly live in a world which leaves very little room for. You say failure, I said exploration, I said experimenting with life. So everybody feels this pathological need to succeed, and in a secular world, failure is a sin. So if in that kind of world, I think there will be very little room for compassion. If I fail, and that failure might humanize me and might make me feel more compassionate to other people's failure. If I'm obsessed with success, then I see everyone who fails around me as a threat to me. That, as I told you in Oxford, there are some people who said that you are not ambitious. I said, well, I am ambitious in my own way. I want to read all the works of Graham Greene. That's my ambition.
You were doing
I want to read all the autobiographies in the world. I want to make a living without stretching myself too thin or whatever. I'm exerting myself in an inhuman. I would like just to make a living in a very humble way. So that's my ambition. But ambition was narrowly defined as a certain kind of success where you are confident and you are trying to destroy the confidence of other people. And you are not making room for failure, exploration, diffidence. So that kind of society, I think, will be dehumanized very quickly. So society doesn't leave room for exploration and therefore failure of us. And failures can be productive. So if in my own life I have seen that I have failed in many ways, But many of these failures have proved productive and have humanized me. At least have made me more compassionate. At least I'm more compassionate towards other people's failures. If I force them to succeed, well, that success may be a desperate kind of success and lead to suicide. So one doesn't know. I think with IITs, people commit suicide. I think that has something to do with this obsession with uninterrupted success. Success and nothing but success, and then it leads to a terrible kind of failure. So I think this room for exploration, room for
success is a failure of vision as well.
Yeah, so that can blind you to our common humanity. I think I'll stop here.
Well, wonderful. So, any questions of Professor Nayak? Yes.
I think that one very interesting thing that you talked about is how English studies gave you a mobility, not only a physical mobility to Oxford, but also mobility in other terms. And I think that is also very true. That holds true even today, because even in Delhi University, the highest admissions you're talking about is English honors. So it's still very popular. So what would you think of English studies?
I would agree with you and disagree with you at the same time. In our university, maybe it's true of Delhi University, for a long time we thought that everyone who studied English will go abroad. Okay? Many of them ended up becoming school teachers in DAV schools or English medium schools. And it's the Sanskrit teachers now who go abroad every year. So things are changing. So we have ICCR, we send Sanskrit teachers to Tokyo, to Thailand, to Russia, to America. So I think we have to change. So we have to look at it through a different lens. It does make you give you a modicum of mobility, but at the same time, other things are also emerging, which you shouldn't lose sight of. Many other subjects are also giving you mobility. I think that we are obsessed with English. We think that English will take us to England. Like in our childhood, we thought that if you study English, one day you will find yourself in England and won't come back. Okay, so that fantasy is gone. I think if you do Sanskrit very well, also you can go abroad. So mobility can be possible through many other routes. Yeah. But I don't disagree with you. Of course it. Yes.
So I just had a question about inhabiting different places and how that changes you, because I come from a small town and I have seen a very vastly different world, and when I think of myself, and if I think of myself in the next year, in the next couple of years, I would probably be inhabiting very different places. And the world doesn't exit you, right? All of that what you've seen is always in you. Yeah. So I was just wondering in terms of
it's like, I think this is a cliche. You can take someone out of a country, but you can't take the country out of him or her. So I may have left that village, I may have left that small town, but that small town remains somewhere within me. The day I expel it from my system, I think I get dehumanized to some extent. So you carry that small town in you all your life, and that will go on enriching you in different ways. So becoming completely absorbed or completely erasing that past will dehumanize us, and that's precisely what is happening to us. Memories are becoming burdens. So we want to erase those memories and reinvent ourselves in some major cities. Then you leave that city, go somewhere else. This kind of rootlessness is not. I don't know anything inevitable about it. You can keep that small town alive in you, and that will do a world of good to you. You don't have to go back to that small town, but that small town can be kept alive in you. You don't have to kill it. That's what precisely we are doing. Trying to kill those small towns, villages that subsist in us. I hope I have. I tried to answer, but may not be satisfactory answer.
Maybe one more question if anybody wants to.
Did you meet the phrase "I was wondering" before you left for Oxford?
Who?
I mean, seminar. This is not meant for you. I mean, I know you use that phrase, but I never encountered. I grew up in a small town, and all that.
I didn't even grow up in a small town. I grew up in a small village.
I know. I never met this phrase that I meet in academia.
Yeah.
I was wondering. did you meet this in India before you
I was
came?
wondering.
Yes.
No,
Like, I was wondering whether this, I was wondering whether that.
No,
Where
no,
did
there was
this
no
wondering
wonder.
come
There's no wonder. So, no, very little. We were too. What should I say? I think there was very little scope for wandering. Life was too hectic for us to survive. So it's a question of survival, emotional as well as material and physical survival. And it was exciting. And I think because you started in a small town and you're here, I started in a small village and I'm here. I think the journey is far more exciting than I think even Amit's journey.
Mine is not exciting.
You have missed it
Yes.
a lot. You have made it, you have got a lot, but you have some missed a lot.
I've got all the prestige of prestigious places. Anyway, and
That's all I think.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Jatin. That was.
It was really wonderful. It was the best thing. It is the best thing I've attended.
I'm glad I have survived.